Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon. We are recording this session of the MLK Beloved Community Weekend Convergence. The Racial Equity and Social Justice Challenge is actually something that was structured by the Knoxville, Tennessee and the Cleveland, Ohio YWCAs as an opportunity to dedicate time and space to build a more effective social justice habits, particularly those dealing with the issues of race, power, privilege, and leadership. And those are both available on the websites for those YWCAs as a 21-day challenge, as a package. And what we're bringing to you today is one of the four different areas: voting, education, criminal justice system, and public health, today being about voting, as kind of a little sampler of this 21-day challenge. So our invitation to you is to participate in the full 21-day challenge if this calls you. The challenge includes reading articles, listening to podcasts, and reflecting on personal experiences and more, and seeing what brings you motivation to be more engaged in your life and experiences that can bring more racial equity and social justice in our nation. My name is Bob Warner. My wife, Noelle Marshall, is with me here today. We call ourselves Life Partners. We are...
Do I get to say hello? Hello.
We are partners with Light to serving our one sacred life, and we are sacred activists, world and U.S. citizens. We are not teachers of this subject. We are, in fact, students of this subject. And so we want to travel that journey with you as students. Two videos. One is called The Myth of Race, and the other one is called Are You a Racist? No is not a good enough answer. That kind of set the stage for us talking today specifically about voting. Here we go. The Myth of Race.
You may think race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then, the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the U.S. needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous 1 drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then, suddenly, in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent, but the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from, or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa, It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
The myth of race. What race are we, in fact? Wow. When we saw that one, it was like, holy cow. And I'm going to go ahead and go to the second video, which is, are you racist? Because no is not good enough.
So I have a question for you. Are you none or are you anti? Several months ago, in response to Ferguson, Baltimore, the killings of Freddie Gray and Tamir Rice, my friend Caitlin put up a Facebook post breaking down the difference between non-racism and anti-racism. Most of us are non-racist. Because racism is looked upon as some moral lapse, we feel quite self-assured by simply not being racist. I'm not a bigot. I don't sing that N-word when my favorite rap jam comes on. I didn't vote for that guy. I'm not burning any crosses. I'm not a skinhead. I don't, I won't, I'm not, I've never, I can't. What you end up with is an entire moral stance, an entire code for living your life and dealing with all the injustice in the world by not doing a damn thing. That's the great thing about none. You can pull it off by simply rolling over in your bed and going to sleep. So why are you sitting at home and watching things unfold on TV instead of doing something about it? Because you're a non-racist, not an anti-racist. Now do this for me. Take the C out of racist and replace it with a P. I'm not a rapist. I'm not friends with any rapist. I didn't buy that rapist last album. All these things that you're not doing. Meanwhile, people are still getting raped and black boys are being killed. It's not enough that you don't do these things. You're going to bed with a clear conscience is not going to stop college students from getting assaulted. You thinking climate change is terrible is not going to stop climate change. You being so assured that you're not anti-black, anti-Muslim won't stop the next hate crime. And it's wonderful that you recognize how brave gay people are when facing persecution, but they aren't the ones who need to be brave. We need to get active. We need to hold people accountable. We need to accept that what hurts one of us hurts all of us. And we need to stop thinking that injustice going on in the world isn't to an extent our fault. We need to stop being none and start being anti.
We're going to share a video which is a good capsule of the history and a very contemporary view, but also including the history of Black voter suppression. It's actually an NBC News clip. The other things that we'd like to show go at different angles from this subject about voting. This one is about Black voter suppression. And I'm going to show a timeline also right after that. But also, if we have time, I'd like to show a little bit of clips and a couple of pieces of articles that talk about the state of Native American voting rights, and also about gerrymandering, and about our felons in our country, after they've served their time to society, quote unquote, allowed to vote in our elections, because the numbers there are staggering and quite impressive as to how many people are kept from voting after they've paid their debt to society. So we'll start off with this 8-minute video, which is the history of Black voter suppression by Latasha Brown, who is the co-founder of Black Voters Matter and the New Georgia Project. So it's quite contemporary piece.
Back bags, we got water, stuff, ponchos if it rains.
They had people out there with like cold water coolers and like snacks and giving people and telling them to stay strong and stay in line. This is what they're doing. They're doing this on purpose so that your voice is not heard. I mean, just like this is going on right now in 2020. It's really ridiculous.
Voter suppression has come up quite a bit during this election cycle.
President Trump tonight, after floating the idea of delaying the November election that he does not have the power to do, is renewing his attacks on mail-in voting. Despite no evidence, it leads to widespread voter fraud.
From the president's warnings about voter fraud via mail-in ballots, to the new Tennessee law that could strip some protesters of their voting rights, or the messy primaries in states like Georgia, Wisconsin, and Louisiana.
When I think about voter suppression and people ask me, well, when did it start? And I say it started when Africans were enslaved and forced to come to this country. There's never been a period of time in this country that there was not voter suppression.
We would love for you all to, one, really share about some of the issues that are going on in your community. Why is this election important? Why is it important that South Georgia is not left out of the process? Because you ain't, because Black voters matter.
Latasha Brown is a longtime political organizer and co-founder of Black Voters Matter, an organization aiming to boost Black voter turnout in presidential and local elections. Their work includes increasing voter registration, voter education, and advocating for policies that expand voting rights and access.
The first election we worked in was in the U.S. Senate race.
And NBC News is now calling Doug Jones the apparent winner.
In a special nationally followed election, Democrat Doug Jones and Republican Roy Moore fought for a Senate seat in Alabama. And for the first time in 25 years, Alabama elected a Democrat to the Senate. And the Black vote was key for the Jones win, with 96% of Black voters backing him.
We use some new tools, new technologies to help concentrate on getting out the vote. And that's what
Black voter turnout increased drastically, and that there was an overperformance of Black voters in that particular election cycle. But we wanted to also send a message of affirmation of how Black voters saw themselves. We would convene these listening circles to talk to communities about what was it that they were concerned about, how did they see power, did they want power, and what did that look like?
Say your name. My name is Evelyn Glass. If you don't get them in the primary, you won't get them there. Because some people just go for that one, but we got to start in the primary to get those people.
That's right. That's right.
This is primary day in Georgia. Lines in Atlanta stretching for blocks. Some standing in the rain, forced to wait hours to cast a ballot.
You've been here about 3 hours. I'm not leaving.
In Georgia, where I live and I am a voter, on election day, what we saw is we saw long lines. I myself, it took me 3 hours to vote. We also got a phone call at 10:30 p.m. that there were 300 African-American voters waiting in line to vote.
It is 11:45 in Georgia, and guess what? We're still at a polling site.
The last voter at that site did not leave until 12:37 a.m.
I had to take my client to go vote because she wanted to go vote in Sandy Springs, and we was in and out in 7 minutes. But I live here in Southwest Atlanta, so this is where I have to go vote, and I've been in line for at least 30 minutes already, and I don't know how long I'm going to be here.
I waited for maybe like 2 to 2.5 hours to vote.
The voting delay occurred in Fulton County, home to 15 cities, including Atlanta, which has a majority Black population.
The primaries in June made me think of what it would be like to live through a tsunami or other natural disaster. And in a sense, it was a natural disaster.
Fulton County election official admitted that there were problems and blamed the delays on an unexpected surge in absentee voting and a reduced number of voting locations due to the pandemic.
We found ourselves with 20% less places than we normally would use for an election. This made it impossible to do a good job, and we didn't.
A democracy docket investigation conducted of Georgia's presidential primaries found that in polling places where the majority of voters were minorities, there was an average wait time of 51 minutes. Meanwhile, at polling locations where white voters were the majority, the average wait time was 6 minutes. Voter suppression isn't a new battle for Black voters in Georgia. In the 2018 governor's race, then Secretary of State Republican Brian Kemp faced off against Stacey Abrams. Kemp's office was accused of purging more than 500,000 voters from the rolls back in 2017. An analysis obtained by the Associated Press reveals racial disparity. Georgia's population is 32% Black, but the list of voter registrations on hold with Kemp's office was 70% Black. In 2018, his office said that they simply conduct regular list maintenance of the voter rolls to ensure election integrity.
So you saw the women's suffrage movement. What was interesting is that while Black women stood with white women in the women's suffrage movement, and we were an instrumental force in that movement, we did not secure the right to vote for ourselves to even 50 years later.
On March 7, 1965, a group of protesters gathered at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, calling for voting rights, with 25-year-old John Lewis leading the way.
We intend to march to Montgomery.
It was the first in a series of planned marches from Selma to Montgomery.
Often what you saw in the Deep South, that people were not even allowed to register to vote. That when they went to register to vote, would walk up and the registrar would say, in order to register, you have to tell me how many jelly beans are in a jar. Or just some ridiculous questions that they would ask them as a tool to prevent them from being able to register. It was in August the 6th, 1965, where the Voting Rights Act was passed. And it was passed because of the work of those folks on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the work all of those years that activists had been doing to demand the right to vote.
In 2013, the Supreme Court invalidated a key part of the Voting Rights Act, and activists alleged that the Supreme Court's decision empowered some states to disenfranchise voters.
So we start seeing in the states that we worked in and lived in voter ID laws, strict voter ID laws. We start seeing a massive closing of polls. We start seeing suppression tactics raise up.
Congressman John Lewis risked his life to expand voting rights. Latasha sees him as an instrumental figure that paved the way for the work that she's doing today.
We must never, ever forget the sacrifice of men and women who put their bodies on the line for freedom and equality.
What they taught me is they taught me what is possible. Where do I and my generation want to take the nation next? We need a radically reimagined America and the way that we conduct voting and elections, that ultimately we should have universal voting. We should have same-day registration. There should be more, instead of where it's been very decentralized, the voting process, that there needs to be more alignment around that. This isn't about the Republicans or the Democrats. The bottom line is voting is a nonpartisan issue. Every single citizen should have free and fair access to the ballot.
When I say black voters, you say matter. Black voters. Black voters.
Wow. Yep. So one of the things I found interesting about that is here we are in 2020 having all kinds of centennial celebration about white suffrage and women's right to vote 100 years ago. And the fact is, white women got the right to vote 100 years ago. It was only 50 years ago with the Voting Rights Act that Black women had it more assuredly as an opportunity for them. I'm going to show a little timeline. I'm going to skip through it real quick because Latasha covered a number of things. And one thing, watching the clock here and realizing I should have asked for an hour and a half, because we definitely want to have some chat about solutions as a part of this hour as well, not just setting up the issues as they exist. So I'm going to go real quick to this. I'm going to go quick to this timeline so we can emphasize a little bit more the Voting Rights Act. So she talked about these things, the Civil Rights Act back in 1866, and the 15th Amendment passed, giving Black men the right to vote. Soon after that, Louisiana and other southern states started coming up with grandfather clauses that disabled the capabilities, and they created all the way up until the 1940s obstacles for voting, like literacy tests and poll taxes and that sort of thing. So I wanted to skim forward in, there's this, she talked about the Selma to Montgomery marches, of course. The Voters' Right Act that was passed in 1964, 1965, signed by Johnson, was very significant. And it really made possible for Black voters and those of color to have more voting rights and not to have these obstacles that were created, particularly by states in the South. And it was extended by Nixon, a Republican, in 1970. It was extended again in 1975 by Gerald Ford, a Republican. And the 25-year extension of the Voters' Rights Act in 1982 by Reagan, a Republican. Interestingly, what happened was that that in 2000 and here we go, where is it there? Voter suppression really started to rise in just in the last 10 to 15 years. And it came by way of various restrictions by states. The Voter Rights Act, that's VRA, the Voters' Right Act, said that certain states that had historically put up obstacles for people like the poll tax and voter registration, that sort of thing, had to have pre-clearance from the United States Attorney General, the federal government, or a 3-judge panel of the District of Columbia to be able to put those in effect. And in fact, since about 2010, 2011, many states have continued to put these in effect. Right here, it shows that laws restricting voting have passed in South Carolina, Texas, and Florida that are disproportionately impacting minority voters. And in fact, many have been struck down by the state Supreme Courts. And so this is the big one in 2011, when Texas passed one of the most restrictive voter laws. Sheila's very familiar with this, under the VRA. And wanted to get over here to 13. Shelby, which is a county in Alabama, and the Shelby Holder case at the Supreme Court crippled one of the most effective protections for voter rights in the country by rendering this pre-clearance thing to not be required anymore. That was struck down by the US Supreme Court. And like within minutes, Texas, Mississippi, North Carolina, Florida, Virginia, South Dakota, Iowa, and Indiana were in with various voter restrictions and voter suppression requirements at a state level. So I just wanted to paint a picture of that a bit to give you an idea of how when you hear people talking about amendments to the Voter Rights Act, and what most recently has been called the John Lewis Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, are actually to bring back as an act of Congress that which the Supreme Court took away in 2013. So that's a bit of a solution, if you will. There were actually, that was actually proposed in the last Congress, the Voter Rights and Advancement Act, which was renamed the John R. Lewis Voting Act right after he passed. Oh, here's what I want to show. I want to show the Native Americans real quick. This is an article. I just highlighted a couple of paragraphs to give you a little bit of perspective in here. Although Native Americans are legally citizens of the United States since in 1924, the road to franchise has not been an easy one. The right of Native Americans to vote in U.S. elections was recognized for the first time. Are you not seeing that on the screen share? Was not recognized until in 1948 in landmark cases. Native Americans, let me summarize, Native Americans were not eligible to vote in federal elections in every state until 1962. And there's still a number of suppression and roadblocks that are thrown in their way today, which are challenges to them getting to it. For example, a quick example is that it may seem like no big deal to have a voter registration that requires you to have a home address, a street address. But many Native Americans that live on reservations, they don't have traditional street addresses. And so their applications, in fact, have been rejected in many states, saying that they can't vote because they don't meet the state requirement, which was put in place specifically for that reason, to disenfranchise the Native American vote. States with voter ID laws don't even accept a tribal ID as a valid ID for them to be able to vote. So it's there's a lot of things that are thrown in the way, if you will. So this next one will be a brief video to get us all on the same playing field in our basic understanding of gerrymandering.
You think when you vote, you get to pick your leaders, right? Wrong. Before you get to the ballot box, politicians have already picked you. In fact, if you voted against the politician who won, they can literally cut you out of the next election so you can't vote against them next time.
It's a nefarious process called gerrymandering. When Americans vote for Congress, we vote in geographical groups called districts. Those districts elect politicians to send to Congress. Districts are supposed to be drawn so they accurately reflect how people vote across a state. So if a party has 50% of the vote, they should get about 50% of the representation. But here's what really happens. Once politicians get into power, they can redraw district lines to effectively guarantee their re-election and skew statewide representation, regardless of how the people vote. Sound like cheating? It is. In fact, because of gerrymandering, 84% of all congressional districts across America are uncompetitive, and none of Ohio's are competitive. Before the election even starts, we already know who's going to win. Ohio is a swing state. That means about half the voters support each political party, but one political party holds 75% of congressional seats. How is that possible? Well, if you live in Cleveland, for example, you might think you'd be voting with everyone who lives in the surrounding Cuyahoga County. But politicians have drawn these crazy district lines that stretch all the way from Worcester to Canton to Akron, so they can control which voters get to vote in your district. Gerrymandering is about political power, and both parties do it when they're in charge of drawing districts. And it means political insiders have more power than voters when it comes to who gets elected. The US is the only democracy in the world that allows it. Okay, we're a republic, but you get what I'm saying. But here's the good news. Voters can enact new laws to stop partisan gerrymandering. We can make it so both sides have to agree on how districts are drawn, taking the process out of the back rooms and putting it in the open. Bye-bye self-serving politicians. Hello, voice of the voters. Share this video to spread the word.
So that is as quick as you can talk about gerrymandering. There are a lot of videos online about gerrymandering. And looking at how much time we have at this point, I'm not going to show the one that I had queued up for specifically to talk about how this affects people of color. So we've watched a few videos about the history of Black voter suppression. I looked at the timeline of Black voter suppression, just a little bit about the fact that many of our Native American relatives in this country still have an uphill battle and are being suppressed by various voter restrictions and voter system restrictions, and just finished watching a video about gerrymandering in the United States, which, by the way, is not a partisan issue. It just so happens that many of the state legislatures now are Republican, and with the census just taken in 2020, every 10 years, the census numbers is the data that's used by the state legislatures in the following year, as in 2021, to rewrite the congressional district lines. And so it isn't a matter of whether Republicans do it into Democrats and rearrange how things are. It's really a question of, in any given state legislature, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, because they do the same thing when they're in power in a state legislature, do with the census information every 10 years. And we're hearing things about the census and how that will determine the amount of money that's used, comes from federal programs, et cetera, et cetera. But another very important part of the use of the census data is to draw congressional district lines. Part of the solution about gerrymandering, and we're going to include here in the next 15 minutes a resource document for you that you can do further research. Part of the solution about gerrymandering is this: there are some states that have called for independent, citizen-run committees to draw the district lines rather than whatever party is in charge of the state legislature in the first year of a decade. There's some very positive, and there have been some states that have accomplished that, and some locales that have accomplished that. So that's the thing to be looking for as far as solution. I'd like to jump to the subject of felons voting. So if you were given a test on whether felons in your state, either that are in jail right now or that have served their time are allowed to vote in elections, in federal elections. How do you think you would do on that test? Well, let me give a screen share here. There are some states where prisoners can actually vote when they're in jail. And so I want to share this with you, that almost more than in the 2016 election, more than 6 million Americans were prohibited from voting due to a felony conviction. That includes more than 20%, back to the subject of racism, that includes more than 20% of all potential Black voters in Florida, Kentucky, our now home of Tennessee and Virginia. In those states, 20% of all Black voters were prohibited from voting because of their felony conviction. So there are movements around the country to bring, including one here in Tennessee currently, and one that's been fought for the last 5 or 6 years in Florida that you may have heard about, that are about allowing former felons to be able to, or as they call them in Florida, returning citizens, to be able to gain their right to vote again. It's a very substantial number, and it's something that's held over the heads of those that have, like I said, committed a crime that was a felony and served their time. So there's a lot you could read about that subject. And this is a new subject for discussion here. The subject is ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting exists in 2 of the 50 states and in a number of cities and counties around the country. And it's a whole new way of assuring that, well, it has a lot of benefits. And I think this video will help you out in understanding that.
So what is ranked choice voting? In most parts of the United States, voters select a single candidate for each position on their ballot, and the candidate with the most votes wins. This is known as single-choice winner-take-all, which can sometimes result in the election of a candidate who earned only a small percentage of the vote, even when the majority of voters supported other candidates. But that's not the only way of electing our leaders. Ranked choice voting is another voting method which allows voters to rank their candidates in order of preference. In a ranked choice voting election, a candidate needs to earn more than half of the votes to win. All first choices are counted, and if a candidate has a majority, then they win, just like any other election. If not, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who picked that candidate as number 1 will have their votes count for their next choice. This process continues until a candidate earns a majority and is declared the winner. Let's look at an example. Here, you select orange as your first choice candidate, yellow as your second, pink as your third, and green as your final choice. The first choices are counted. Yellow earned 35%, orange 21%, pink earned 28%, and green earned 16% of the vote. Because nobody won more than 50%, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who picked him as their first choice have their ballots count for their second choice. This continues until a candidate receives more than half of the votes, or 50% plus 1. So what are some of the benefits of ranked choice voting? Ranked choice voting provides more choices, allowing more than 2 candidates to compete without fear of splitting the vote among like-minded individuals. Sometimes voters feel pressured to vote for the lesser of 2 evils. Ranked choice voting allows people to vote for their favorite candidate, not just against the candidates they dislike. With ranked choice voting, we see more positive campaigns and less negative advertising. Candidates are encouraged to reach out to as many voters as possible, including those supporting their opponents. They can build a winning coalition with like-minded candidates to earn voters' second and third choices. It's time to fix our democracy and make our elections work better for everybody. We can do that with ranked choice voting. Visit www.fairvote.org to find out how you can get involved.
There really are a lot of benefits to ranked choice voting. And part of it is that in cities and counties where it has been implemented it's really seen to do a number of things, including that more of the majority feel like they voted for the person who eventually wins. In fact, we were on a Represent Us call last night, and they pointed out that in the 2016 election, and I don't say this as a partisan thing, but just as a fact of the way the system works today, which would be eliminated by ranked choice voting. In 2016, 10% of the people that voted in 2016 put Donald Trump in the position to be the Republican candidate for presidency. 10%. Because they made him the candidate of through the primaries. Then we all got our choice of one of two that we might not have liked to pick from after the primaries were over. And so this idea that third-party candidates have more of an opportunity. So if you really feel like Jill Stein is your candidate, and secondarily, Hillary Clinton, you vote for her as your second choice, you get to actually vote that way at the ballot, rather than saying, well, I have to vote for Hillary, who I don't want to, because my principles say I should vote for Jill Stein. But so the fact is that if neither of the candidates got over 50%, your vote for Hillary Clinton would have popped up into her stack. And so it helps us with not having to vote for our sort of the lesser of two evils. And the point that went by there very quickly was the comment about less negative ads. It's been very interesting in cities and counties where this is in place, where candidates have actually campaigned together and said, I know you might like Noel as your first choice, but please put me on the ballot as your second choice, and vice versa. And those people have created an opportunity for them to work together. And when the results are in, the fact is that there are more people that feel they have voted for the winner. May have been their second choice or their third choice, not just their first choice. But the candidate then also feels an obligation to engage and embrace and represent all of those that voted for them, whether it was the first, second, or third choice. So this is a very important one. That video was brought to you by fairvote.org. It's a great one to do research with. And lastly, if we just chat for a couple of minutes, there are a couple of things that I'd like to mention about House Resolution number 1. House Resolution number 1 was the first bill that was passed by the United States House in the last Congress, the 116th Congress, and it addressed voter access, election integrity, election security, political spending, and ethics in all three branches of government. It was overwhelmingly supported by the then Democratic House as H.R. 1, and it went to the U.S. Senate, where it went into the Speaker, Mitch McConnell's in basket, and remained for the next 2 years. That bill has been reintroduced already in the 117th Congress. And most certainly it will pass, and it will be going to the Senate, where hopefully it will have the light of day opportunity. The resolution, which we highly would recommend you read for yourself and consider whether you should have your congressmen and senators being, actually asking them to be co-sponsors of the bill, really has a very, very big opportunity for it to be passed in this coming time. There is so much about political spending, about campaign financing, about transparency of foreign money in our campaign systems, which today is completely not transparent. We have no idea how much money and big money and PAC money and super PAC money is coming from outside of the United States and affecting our elections. And this resolution supports all of that. Of course, there's the opposite side of the argument that argues against it. We know what those arguments are because our congressman wrote to us in his daily newsletter and told us everything that was wrong with it, right out of the speaking points from the Heritage think tank, which is that it's telling states how to run their elections, and the federal government shouldn't be doing that. So I recommend highly for your consideration to look at HR 1 in this new Congress and seeing if you don't think when you get down to the details of it, how valuable that could be. The other one, which I mentioned earlier, was HR 4, which is the Voting Rights Advancement Act, since renamed the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would reverse what happened in 2013 in the Supreme Court, allowing many states to basically find ways and loopholes and ways to go against the intention of the original Voter Rights Act from back in the mid-1960s. And I consider that for your suggestion for your study as well on this subject of racial equity. When I said go study HR 1, for example, or HR 4, the Voter Rights Advancement Act, the perfect place to go, that nonpartisan place to go for that is Ballotpedia. Ballotpedia has all the information about all of the votes, the congressmen, everything in the executive branch, everything in the legislative branch, and all matters that come before the House and the Senate. The other big reference that I want to mention verbally for those that we don't get our reference paper to is the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a nonprofit and nonpartisan advocacy group about empowering voters and defending democracy. And they are, in our opinion, the #1 place to go to find out what positions different candidates have during an electoral cycle and what the issues are. They don't say vote for this or vote for that. They go to all the candidates and ask questions and ask them what their position is on things, and either the candidates respond or they don't respond. And the League of Women Voters has both the national, state level leagues and local leagues. And since Noelle and I have kind of got a home base here in Northeast Tennessee now, we've gotten very involved in the local League of Women Voters for Northeast Tennessee. And it's actually them that brought our attention to this 21-day challenge at the YWCAs. So we highly recommend the League of Women Voters and represent.us, which is a nonpartisan democracy reform movement dedicated to creating a government of, by, and for the people. So we have just a few minutes left. I want to open the mic to anyone who, Karen or Fumi or Sheila or anyone else that would like to chat for a moment. We're going to try to get these reference documents in here for you.
I'd love to just say thank you so much, Bob and Noelle, for bringing this out, for us to become educated. Personally, this was a great educational event program for me. And, to make changes, we have to know what we want to change. So this is really great to really key in on the issues. And just FYI, the Japanese Americans were finally able to become citizens and vote in 1952. So just another,
right.
piece of information.
Thank
Interesting.
you.
They got that right before the Native Americans or our Black friends. That's pretty interesting because they were incarcerated during World War II here in this country. So lots of, prejudice against that group of people. So thank you anyway, Bob and Noelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Fumi. Yeah, I noticed that in some of the research I've done in the last week about the Japanese Americans, and it's really quite stunning as to how far we've come, how long it's taken, and how much people, I think too many of us, particularly white folks, make assumptions about voting and about the privilege of voting and how easy it has been for us and how that has not been the case for many of our fellow citizens along the way, including those that were citizens before we came to the United States and invented U.S. citizenry, or Native American.
Former presidential candidate Scott Walker summed up our current system of electing the president by saying,
"Nation as a whole is not going to elect the next president. 12 states are."
Governor Mitt Romney said,
"And so all the money will get spent in 10 states.
This video explains why more than 3/4 of the people of the United States are politically irrelevant in general election.
How that can be changed in order to make every voter in every state relevant in every presidential election."
The National Popular Vote Bill would guarantee
presidential candidate Scott Walker Former presidential candidate Scott Walker summed up our current system of electing the president by saying,
"Nation as a whole is not going to elect the next president. 12 states are."
Governor Mitt Romney said,
"And so all the money will get spent in 10 states.
This video explains why more than 3/4 of the people of the United States are politically irrelevant in general election campaigns for president, and how that can be changed in order to make every voter in every state relevant in every presidential election. The National Popular Vote Bill would guarantee the presidency to the candidate receiving the most popular votes in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. The President of the United States is elected by 538 presidential electors. The Constitution lets each state choose the method of selecting its electors. Today, 48 states use the so-called winner-take-all law that awards all of a state's presidential electors to the candidate who gets the most popular votes inside each separate state. For example, because Obama received 1.5 million votes in Minnesota and Romney got only 1.3 million, all 10 of Minnesota's electoral votes for president were cast by Democratic electors.
Because of state winner-take-all laws, 5 of our 45 presidents have come into office without receiving the most popular votes nationwide. This occurs when a candidate wins a couple of states by a small margin while losing the rest of the country by a large margin. For example, in 2016, President Trump won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania by a total of 78,000 votes, thereby winning a majority in the Electoral College while losing the country by 2.8 million votes. Each of these 78,000 voters was 36 times more important than the 2.8 million voters elsewhere. Similarly, 537 voters in Florida in 2000 were 1,000 times more important than 537,000 voters elsewhere in the country. Near misses are common under the current system. A shift of 60,000 votes in Ohio in 2004 would have elected the second-place candidate despite President George W. Bush's nationwide lead of 3 million votes. Because a few thousand votes in any one of a dozen closely divided battleground states can decide the presidency, the winner-take-all system repeatedly creates unnecessary controversies and crises, even when the choice of the nation's 140 million voters is clear. Moreover, the outsized national impact of a few thousand votes in battleground states virtually invites foreign interference in our elections. In a nationwide vote for president, every vote will be equal throughout the country. State winner-take-all laws have other adverse effects.
Neither candidate has any reason to campaign in any state where he is safely ahead or hopelessly behind.
For example, the only states that received any general election campaign events in 2012 were the 12 states where Romney's support was in the narrow range between 45% and 51%. 38 states were ignored, including 12 of the 13 smallest states and almost all rural, agricultural, southern, western, and northeastern states.
23 reliably Republican states were totally ignored by both parties, as were 15 Democratic states in the District of Columbia.
In 2016, virtually all general election campaign events were in 12 closely divided states where Trump support was between 43% and 51%. Similarly, in 2008, virtually all campaigning was in 14 closely divided states. But there's more at stake than whether babies don't get kissed in the states that get ignored.
In his book, Presidential Pork, Dr. John Hudak of the Brookings Institution documents how battleground states receive 7% more presidentially controlled grants, twice as many disaster declarations, and considerably more Superfund and No Child Left Behind exemptions. The Small Business Administration's largest loan in history was to a ricotta cheese factory, described by President Obama as, quote, the tastiest investment the government has ever made, unquote, located in, you guessed it, Ohio. Meanwhile, Professors Douglas Kreiner and Andrew Reeves show how the interests of battleground states shape innumerable government policies, including steel quotas imposed by the free trade president from the Free Trade Party. Even travel by sitting presidents and cabinet members is skewed to battleground states. Indeed, flyover states are so irrelevant that presidential candidates don't even bother polling them to see what issues might be of concern to their voters. As a former White House press secretary said, quote, if people don't like it, they can move from a safe state to a swing state. Fortunately, thanks to the National Popular Vote Bill, people don't have to move to another state in order to make their vote count. The cause of all these problems, namely the state-by-state, winner-take-all method of choosing presidential electors, is not in the Constitution. It was not debated at the Constitutional Convention and was never mentioned in the Federalist Papers. Only 3 states used winner-take-all in our nation's first presidential election in 1789, and all 3 repealed it by 1800. It was not till 1880 that winner-take-all was adopted by all the states. These state winner-take-all laws can be repealed in the same way that they were originally enacted, namely by passing a different state law. In the leading case governing the selection of presidential electors, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that the choice of method belongs exclusively to the states.
As of 2020, 15 states and the District of Columbia have enacted the National Popular Vote Bill into law, including 4 small states, 8 medium-sized states, and 3 big states. Moreover, 1 legislative chamber has approved the bill in 9 other states, including a bipartisan 28-18 vote in the Republican-controlled Oklahoma Senate and a bipartisan 37-21 vote in the Republican-controlled Arizona House.
The National Popular Vote law will take effect when identical laws are enacted by states possessing a majority of the Electoral College, that is 270 out of 538. After taking effect, every vote will be equal throughout the United States, thus making every voter in every state politically relevant in every presidential election. All of the presidential electors from the enacting states will be supporters of the candidate receiving the most popular votes in all 50 states and D.C., thereby guaranteeing the presidency to the candidate receiving the most popular votes nationwide.
In a nationwide election in which every vote is equal, candidates will have to pay attention to the concerns of voters in all 50 states.
The National Popular Vote Compact is a constitutionally conservative, state-based approach. It does not alter the Constitution and does not violate the Constitution. It retains the Electoral College and state control of elections. Additional videos discuss various specific aspects of the National Popular Vote Compact. Learn more at nationalpopularvote.com and from the book, Every Vote Equal, a state-based plan for electing the president by national popular vote, which can be read or downloaded for free or purchased from Amazon.
Please use our convenient email system to ask your state legislators to support the National Popular Vote Bill.
Thank you all for coming and being a part of this. Thank you. For those who would like additional resources for supporting spiritual growth, environmental sustainability, social justice, and democracy reform, please check out our website at www.lightpartners.org.